Well, hello again and welcome to the VK6CS Fun with Amateur Radio channel. I just thought I'd do a bit on the GS-35B Triode that I'm going to be using in my HF amplifier. A couple of people have asked me about it. They're from Russia. I don't think they're made anymore. They're probably all new old stock. They're a very robust looking tube. I've heard they're actually very robust to run. They're roughly the equivalent of a 3CX 1500, which is an American triode. You can tell it's a triode because it's a 3CX. If it was a tetrode, it would be 4CX. And the number following that is the plate dissipation. So 3CX 1500 is a triode that dissipates 1500 watts. Now, to the GS-35B. I was talking to someone on the local repeater the other day, and they said, "How much is your amplifier going to weigh, Steve?" I said, "Oh well, you know, it's 25 kilos for the transformer, HT transformer. You know, probably a few kilos for the other transformers. You know, a couple of kilos or so for the case, probably 2.5 kilos for the valve. You know, or the tube." And one of the fellows said, 2.5 kilos for a tube. That's a bit. That's a big tube, that's a heavy tube. And I said, well, yeah, I actually looked at the spec, it's 2.8 kilos, but I've got a bathroom scale here. I know they're not terribly accurate, but I'm going to stick it on the bathroom scale and see what happens. But first, I thought I'd show you the socket. I think you may have seen this socket previously, but probably not in close-up. I mean, looking into that, it looks like looking into something from a science fiction movie, doesn't it? I don't know if I can point actually without upsetting the focus. Let's give it a go. Down in here. Down in here is a filament. That's the filament ring. That's a cathode filament ring because the filament is the cathode is connected to one side of the filament. I'll do a bit of doodling in a sec on the board. I'll show you what I mean by that. Then there's a grid ring. This is the grid ring here, and this big ring here is the anode ring. So when the tube is pushed into the socket, the rings on the tube make contact with these rings here, and the actual connection to the tube is solder tags. Solder tags. This is connected to this ring here that makes contact with the valve anode. There's a couple of those on there. So when it's mounted in my amplifier, it'll be mounted like that. The RF choke will be off, sort of like at that sort of angle, and there'll be a resistor coming down here with a few turns over it as a parasitic suppressor, just going to the anode connection on the tube. And of course there'll be another connection going off to the tank coil. Now I bought this. You may remember I bought this peg box to do an experiment to see if it would make a suitable air box for my GS-35B. I still haven't decided yet whether I'm going to be using this peg box. I'll take these lugs off, draw these rivets out, take these things off, and put some angle on there. I'll probably take the polka dots off as well. You know, not overly keen on the pink polka dots, but you know, probably spray this box black if I use it. On the inside, you'll see, you should be able to see. There's the valve base. It's almost as deep as this box. I don't know if you can see that, but there's the edge of the box, and there's the bottom of the valve base. So if I put the screwdriver in there, you know, the valve base is that deep, very deep valve base. So that sort of limits the or it means that you can't, if you want to use that valve base, you can't use your enclosure has to be quite tall to you know, so you can mount the airbox and the tube, because the tube protrudes a couple of inches or so. I have seen some smaller valve bases for the GS-35B, and I did actually consider clamping the grid to the chassis. I've seen that done as well, making up a little box, clamping the grid to the chassis and then sort of blowing some air around it. But I thought, no, well, I got the socket with the tube for a very reasonable price. It's built like a tank, this socket. So I'll give it a crack. Now, this is the filament. This is the cathode filament. The next one up, I've taken all the original solder tags off and I put some nice new ones on. So that's the cathode connection, one side of the filament, that's the other side of the filament. That is the grid connection there. Of course these solder tags are fine. Sort of current that's going to be running through it, you know, it's going to be sort of maybe running through the cathode. 3 amps running through the filaments, and I don't know, probably 300 milliamps or so going through the grid. So solder tags are perfectly fine with the screws going into the metal rings inside there to make those connections. And the idea, of course, is that you have a fan, either a snail blower on the side or a muffin fan underneath, which is what I'm going to try. Now, I did some experiments and I think that I might just be getting enough air through it, but because this is going to be a detachable module, if it requires modification, it won't be a problem. So I'm gonna try my small fan because it's quieter, and I don't think, I mean, there's a fair bit of air. There's I'll say a fair bit more air with the larger fan, in that it will stand up a piece of A4 where the other piece won't. It will stand up a kitchen towel vertically with the airflow, but it won't stand up a bit of A4, whereas the bigger fan will, but the bigger fan is bloody noisy. So I'll decide what to do a little bit closer to when I come to cutting the hole for the fan. Okay, so that's the socket mounted in the experimental airbox. Now, if I was actually going to use this airbox, I'd get a couple of blocks of wood and just tap that. So, because it's fairly thin tin, I'd tap that so it's nice and flat, and then drill the holes to bolt the valve base in. At the moment, it's only held in with masking tape, so that just to give me an airtight seal, just so I could look at the airflow going through it when I had the fan mounted underneath it. So that's the socket. Now, very, very robust. I've heard people say, there's no problem mounting the GS-35B horizontally, and there isn't. I've looked at the specification, you can do that. But they've said the problem is getting a valve socket, because it's such a heavy tube, it droops. This is the proper socket for it from the Soviet Union. I tell you what, when that is plugged in there, it won't droop. You can mount that upside down, you can mount it sideways, you can mount it any way you like, and that valve is staying in that socket. Well, actually, no, I wouldn't mount it upside down, but certainly horizontally, there's no problem at all. And it's got a lot to do with the structure inside the valve as well as how well it's held. And I'll get the board out in a minute. I'll show you what I mean by that. But the internal structure of the valve allows it to be mounted horizontally. Okay. Well, there's the airbox. It's spelled PEGS. It must be a Russian spelling, but it actually says airbox, GS-35B airbox. So whether I'll make up another airbox or whether I'll go for that one, still undecided, because the valve, when it's in there, is a very firm fit, and the only way to get it out is to put a threaded bolt in the top of it and pull it out with put a bit of cable around the bolt and pull the thing out. Now this may be a little bit, this tin box just maybe a little bit on the flimsy side for that. It might be okay once I've got the angle round it and it's bolted up, but still undecided. Okay, so the tube itself, what does that look like? I think I might have shown you this before actually, but it's quite a nice looking tube. There we go. Ceramic Triode with a big copper anode radiator on it. That's the filament ring, that's the cathode filament ring, that's the grid ring, and that's the anode connection there. Now, I'll give you an idea of how big it is. How big it is? How big is it? Do you want it in millimetres? Is that millimetres? Centimetres, okay. Alright, so how big is that in centimetres? So 18 centimetres? I don't know if you can see that. Let's roll that up a bit there. I'd say that's about 180 centimetres. Probably can't see that ruler, but that there is 18 centimetres, 180 millimetres. So I'd say it's about 18 centimetres or 180 millimetres long. It's got a 1500 watt anode dissipation, which means the power you get out of it compared to the power you put into it can't exceed 1500 watts. It can dissipate 1500 watts of heat. And there we go. I think I might have shown you this before, but you know, it's a nice looking thing, so I'll show you again. There you go, you can see right through the anode radiator. There's the threaded part of it where you can put a bolt in to actually pull it out of the socket. And there's the grid ring. There's the grid ring there. Cathode filament and filament. So you can actually just make a hole in the chassis that diameter, put the thing in, clamp it down, and then just put clamps around there and there to use the tube and around the anode as well. You don't need a socket, but I think the socket's more convenient for getting the airflow through it. Correct. Okay. So there's the tube, the valve, the GS-35B. I'll just put a bathroom scale on the table. I'll show you what it weighs, if I can. And then I'll show you, I'll do a bit of doodling. Just when you thought you were going to escape. Okay, a bathroom scale. And a triode. Okay, so now of course you can't see the bathroom scale. There we go. Right, well, let's zoom in on that. And that is that's 5 kilos there, so we're looking at the red scale, so that's 1, that's 2, so it's between 2 and 3 kilos. The spec says 2.8 kilos. If you look at that, 1, 2, it looks a little bit closer to 2 than 3, but I would say that the bathroom scale is not a very accurate thing at those sort of weights. You know, it's used to having people standing on it, so it tends to be it's probably a little more accurate at the other end of the scale. But as you can see, that looks like a fairly weighty bit of kit. And okay, let's zoom out. Ooh. And I'll see if I can show you something on the board. I can tell you a BORED, but you can always hit stop. There you go. Watching this is not compulsory, mercifully. Okay, let's get rid of that and get rid of the bathroom scale. Now, will this fit on here? I've been doing some stuff on the table, so it might not actually fit. Oh, that's not bad. Now, will it focus? That's the other question, isn't it? I'll take that out a bit. Yeah. There we go. Right, now, some valves inside, they have a structure, so you've got a cathode, and then you'd have a filament that goes up inside it to heat it up, like that. And then you'd have a couple of insulated posts, like that, and you would have a grid wound around those posts, like that, and then you would have your anode box over the top like that, and that's how your triode would look. Now, some of these triodes you can't mount horizontally because the way the grid is wound around those posts, if you were to mount it horizontally like that, so if you look, imagine looking at the end of the tube. So there's the anode box. And then you would have the cathode, and then you would have your supporting things, and it would be wound like that. So that's how it would look at the end. That's that coil there, looking at it end on. Then when the valve gets hot, the grid sags. The grid sags down, and the valve can get very upset if the grid touches the cathode. The grid distorts. So if you were going to mount a valve like that horizontally, you'd have to do it like that. Got the cathode. And the grid would be mounted like that, and then it would be then it would stay reasonably happy. Not all valves. There are many valves that the specification for them says do not mount them horizontally. Some will say, oh, it's okay to mount this valve horizontally, and not make any further specification than that. Others will say it's okay to mount this valve vertically, horizontally, but mount it so that the anode box, because normally they're not square, like that, is in the vertical plane, or it might say between pins 2 and 5 or whatever, and what that will mean is that it's in that plane, not that plane. If you mount it in that plane, you can use it horizontally. If you mount it in that plane, you can't. And that's what that's why you've got to be a little bit careful if you're playing around with tube amplifiers and you want to mount the tubes horizontally. First of all, you've got to make sure that you can look at the spec, so make sure that you can mount the thing horizontally. And secondly, if you can mount it horizontally, is there an additional specification whereby it says, you know, mount it so that the anode box is in the vertical plane, mount it so that it's vertical between pins 2 and 5, that sort of thing. All right. Now the GS-35B doesn't look like that inside at all. This is why you can mount it horizontally, and it doesn't bother it in the least. The sponge isn't wet. Not the one off the soldering iron. There we go. Made the board a little gritty, but it's done the job. Doing a bit of soldering earlier on. Right, now inside the GS-35B, the cathode is actually a disc. It's a looks like a little puck, and it's got a heater. It's got a heating element in it, and the cathode's connected to one side of those heaters. And the actual, and if you look down on that, it's circular. It's not a very good circle, but that's the cathode. And across that is a domed. It's a concave or convex? Convex, I think it is. It's domed upwards. A mesh like that. So if you look down on it, there's a mesh dome. You can imagine that's a sort of fine mesh. So the grid itself is like a disc of mesh, and it's domed over the cathode puck, and then the anode is a sort of concave copper disc above that. So the anode disc looks the same as that. That's concave, that's convex, and you've got the mesh grid in between. So because it's circular and because it's a domed grid, it doesn't care whether it's this way up or that way up. Don't know whether you could hang it upside down. You probably could. I doubt that they'd recommend that because it's a military valve, and even though it fits in the socket very well, I reckon if you gave it a bumpy ride,